The history of the legions is complicated at best. There were many points during and on the lead up to the Horus Heresy where small changes could have given us a vastly different outcome. I think it's part of the charm that the exact end result we received wasn't necessarily inevitable. What if the technology to remove Angron's butcher's nails were found during the Great Crusade, or Magnus hadn't tried to contact the Emperor? If Russ's suspicion and paranoia of sorcery had led his forces to be nearly destroyed at Prospero, could the savage nature of his sons pique the interest of the Blood God himself? Taking inspiration from the Dornian Heresy, in this video I'll be imagining just what this change in events could have resulted in, and asking, what if Russ became the Daemon Primarch of Khorne? The basis of this conversion would be the new Demon Prince Angron, which I was fortunate enough to receive in advance of its release from Games Workshop. This model, with its bulk and cornate symbols, would make for the perfect basis for a Khorne Corrupted Russ. So, work was started by removing the parts required to build the legs, torso and arms from the sprue, before cleaning up the parts of any mold lines and sprue tabs. The main goal of this conversion was to change Angron's appearance to be closer to that of a huge wolfen, and the first change to achieve this was to clip away the tip of the Stegosaurus-like tail. The spikes were retained for later on, but for now I concentrated on rounding off the tip of the tail using my scalpel. With the tip rounded out, the tail was glued together. The seams were filled and then attached to the torso. In order to give the Angron model a more wolfy look, the feet needed to be changed. The hooves that Angron sports would be modified to appear as clawed toes instead. To do this, the hooves were first rounded out with clippers. This gave me the rough shape of two toes, but they were further smoothed out with my knife. With one foot complete, the same process was repeated on the second foot. With the hooves rounded out into rough toe shapes, the upper claws were then glued to the feet. The new toes needed claws added, but I didn't want to add anything without attaching them to the base first. This would make sure that I didn't accidentally position them in a way that would prevent me from attaching the feet to the rocky outcrop. So, before going any further with the build, the base was assembled, the legs were attached to the torso, and finally, everything was attached to the base. To create the clawed toes, I grabbed the clipped tail end from earlier and glued its two halves together, clamping them in place to create a firmer bond. Once dried, the four top claws were separated from each other with clippers. The two larger spikes would form the inner toe, whereas the smaller pair would be the outer. But before these could be added to the feet, the claws and toes both needed to be trimmed and cleaned up. The goal here was to round out the cuts, giving them a more natural appearance, whilst also creating a nice smooth surface that would allow the claws to be easily attached. With everything prepped, the claws were glued into place. The joins were pretty rough though, and the shaved down hooves still weren't looking like toes. I would resolve this problem with green stuff. After cutting and mixing up a small batch, small blobs of green stuff were rolled out and pressed into the feet and around the toes. By using a combination of metal and rubber-tipped sculpting tools, the green stuff was worked to create a larger pad, where the foot's weight was being applied, with the smaller toe sitting between it and the claw. I added a series of creases and folds too, hoping to create the appearance of weight being applied. While sculpting, I used a little Vaseline over my tools during this process, which just helped to prevent the putty from sticking to my tools and fingers. Just be sure to wipe away any excess before you paint over it. A dry cloth or paper towel will be sufficient to remove any greasy residue. While the feet cured, I could continue assembling the rest of the model. The right knee pad had a fairly obvious World Eater symbol depicted on it. The teeth were fairly generic, but the raised continents that depicted the world being eaten would need to be carefully shaved back. With the topography removed and the teeth still in place, both knee pads were glued to the legs. Another World Eater symbol that needed to be removed was found on the buckle. This would be covered over with a wolf pelt that was taken from the Space Wolf Dreadnought kit, but before I could attach the fur, the raised symbol needed to be clipped and shaved flat. After comparing the pelt to the buckle, I found that further trims were still needed in order to allow the pelt to sit properly. In addition to this, I also temporarily removed the left leg from the pelt to allow it to fit. Once I was happy with how everything was lining up, the pelt was glued in place and the legs and the waist continued to be assembled. With the lower half of the model built, I felt that it would be a good time to start adding some fur. This would not only help to distance the final result from Angron's base model, but it would also help to bring the model closer to the Space Wolves, albeit in a more demonic form. The fur was created by mixing up more green stuff before adding and flattening a blob at the base of the tail. A series of lines were then cut into the putty to form a crosshatch. This would act as a guide to help me define the tufts of fur. Using the sharp edge of a metal tool, I then scoured in a series of shallower and more curved tufts in order to give the impression of individual strands of fur. During this process, I dragged the fur downwards to give the idea of the fur laying in the same direction. Using this same process, I continued to build up fur around the legs. You may notice a few yellow lumps in my green stuff. Unfortunately, my yellow strip had hardened up and I hadn't quite realised until I'd already done a lot of the work. So if you'll find yourself with the same problem, I'd recommend getting some fresh putty and starting again. After finishing off the fur on the lower half of the model and giving the putty a chance to fully cure, I continued assembling the torso. I added the power pack and then began removing yet another World Eater symbol from the back plate. After clipping and smoothing it flat, a Space Wolf symbol was added in its place. Again, to move away from the original Angron model, the various pipes and butcher's nails were clipped away and smoothed back from the neck. With the torso complete, I could begin work on the arms. The left arm would normally carry the chain axe, but this would be replaced with the claws from the Murder Fang variant of the Space Wolf Dreadnought. First, I clipped the axe from either side of the fist and then used my knife to clean up and flatten. My pin vise was then used to remove the remaining part of the axe handle from the hand. I began with a small 1mm hole before progressing to steadily larger bits. Once the handle had been drilled out, further trims were made to clean up the hand. With the hand complete, the rest of the arm was assembled. To replace the axe, I first compared the Dreadnought claw against the fist, before making a few adjustments to help it fit better. Finally, the weapon was glued into place before the arm was attached to the torso. For the right arm, the only modification I made to the base kit was to attach a small wolf skull to just above the hilt of the sword. I wanted a slight nod to the Russ's original sword, and this seemed like the simplest way to achieve it. With the skull in place, the sword and arm were assembled and attached to the torso. For the head, the model needed something that reflected the wolf-like nature that I tried to convey across the rest of the build. My initial idea was the Thunderwolf cavalry, but the wolves there seemed too pristine. I wanted something that looked sufficiently angry whilst also being wolf-like, which is why I settled on one of the Khorne hounds. It was the right size and had the same kind of aesthetic as the rest of the Angron model, but it did need a good deal of adjustment. First, I clipped away the frill before cleaning up the surfaces with my knife. From here, the two halves of the head were glued together. In order to attach the head to the torso, the neck needed to be clipped back, partly to reduce the length, but also to create a flat surface. Once the neck had been sufficiently trimmed back, the head was glued to it. With the model built, the final step was to fill out some of the gaps and add more fur. I'd chosen not to attach Angron's wings, as they didn't really fit the werewolf theme I was creating. This meant that spots where they'd normally attach to the torso needed to be filled in. This was done with milliput. I like milliput for this kind of large gap filling work, as it's quite easy to work with in large amounts and dries hard enough to build up more putty on top of. After mixing up a batch, I proceeded to add rough lumps and shape them into the shoulders. With the gaps filled, the milliput was allowed to cure fully before proceeding. Finally, more fur could be added. This was done in the same way as I'd approached it across the legs and tail. Fur was built up across the shoulders, neck, and around the face. However, I left the torso mostly blank. The Angron kit is incredibly well designed and allows you to omit most of the torso armour. To blend the fur and the bare areas, I added small tufts and patches, giving the model an almost mangy look, perfect for a follower of chaos. After building up the fur across the neck, face and shoulders, there was just one more thing to add, and that was the ears. As the Khorne hounds are earless, I had to sculpt my own, and this was done by mixing together green stuff and milliput in equal amounts. The resultant mixture had the firmness of milliput, but flexibility and elasticity of green stuff, making it perfect for sculpting harder edged pieces. After mixing, the putty was shaped into a small cone shape and pressed against the side of the head. From here, the shape of the ear was formed by pressing into the bottom of the cone. With the ears in place, all the putty was left to cure fully before I moved on to the painting stage. As is always the case when painting miniatures, the first step was to prime. A black airbrush primer was chosen for this, as it would give me a good starting point that I could take advantage of to create areas of shadow later on. Zenithal shading is a great way to add a little extra realism to your highlights and shadows by lighting up the areas you'd expect light to naturally fall on. It involves taking a lighter paint, thinning it in an airbrush with some airbrush thinners, and spraying it across the upper facing areas of your model. The paint I chose for this was Tamiya XF2 White, with just a tiny amount of XF1 Black mixed in to create a grey. Spraying from above meant that the paint formed only on the upper surfaces and left the undersides and recesses as the base black primer, mimicking the shadows and brighter surfaces created by a natural light source. These highlights were pushed even further by spraying small spots of Tamiya XF2, which were mainly focused across the areas of skin. From here, the rest of the model will be tackled with a regular brush and with paints taken from the Tooth and Coats range. My first task was to tackle all of the base coats, and for each of these I watered down my paint and applied it in, unsurprisingly, 2 thin coats. This just allowed for easier application and a more consistent final result. The first base coat tackled all of the areas of steel, and for this I chose Surcoat Silver. Following this, Spartan Bronze was used to tackle any bronze and gold areas of the model, and with this step complete, I made sure to swap out my paint water to prevent any cross-contamination of metal flakes into my other paints. For the exposed areas of skin, I chose Berserker Red. When it came to picking a skin colour, I had a lot of choices, but red seemed like the best idea. After all, this incarnation of Russ is still a Khorne demon print, so a blood red skin made the most sense. Again, the fur had a few options when it came to colour. Russ's original blonde was an option, but it didn't really suit the darker theme I wanted to create with this interpretation of him. I was tempted by black, but decided to sit somewhere in the middle and base coat the fur with Wizard Grey. The choice of colour for the armour was much more straightforward and simply based on the original armour colour of the Space Wolves. To recreate this, I began with a base coat of Dungeon Stone. The various claws, skulls and teeth were then all given a base coat of Dragon Fang. This was followed up with a base coat of Scorched Earth across the leather areas of the model. The next step saw me continuing with Scorched Earth, into which I mixed in a little Dust Bowl to create a slightly darker version of Dust Bowl. This mix was then applied across all of the fur pelts that hung from Russ's belt. The final base coat was to tackle the blades. At first I toyed with the idea of a typical frost-based weaponry, but again, these seemed too bright for the darker tone I was looking to convey, so I settled on an obsidian. To start off this effect, I began with some cold corpse blue. While the base coats were quite dark already, there were a few areas where I wanted to deepen and darken the recesses a little further. Using some Oblivion black, I coated the steel areas, the grey armour and the blades. For the remaining areas, the brown of Battle Mud Wash was used instead. With the base coats and the washes complete, work could begin on lightening up the edges and surfaces with some glazes and highlights. Following the same order as with the base coats, I first began with the metallics and used plate armour to pick out the edges of the steel areas. The resulting fine lines of brighter silver helped the edges to stand out even further against the darker recesses. For just the sharpest points of the metallic areas, I applied a small dot of Mythril Blade in an extreme highlight. A similar process was followed for the bronze and gold areas. I began with a highlight of Dragon's Gold, followed by an extreme highlight of Glistening Gold. Once again, I refreshed my paint water after this step. For the red areas, a glaze was created using some Sanguine Scarlet, which was thinned out with some glaze medium, but water could be used instead. This mixture created an extremely translucent mixture that could be steadily layered up over the surfaces. These multiple layers can be used to build up transitions and gradients from the darker recesses to the lighter raised details. The Sanguine Scarlet glaze was built up across the skin and applied across the raised details in the musculature. This process was repeated using the brighter Demon Red, but this time I focused the paint over a smaller area and mainly onto the upper parts of the model. In addition to the glaze, a less diluted mix of this paint was also used as an edge highlight, which was followed up with an extreme highlight of Fanatic Orange. The fur was tackled with a series of highlights. Wizard Grey was first used to pick out the strands of fur, followed by Carcharodon Grey, which was applied across the smaller amount of strands. And then finally, some White Star was used to pick out the very tips of a few of the more pronounced tufts. For the armour, I began with a glaze of Dungeon Stone Grey, before highlighting first with Wizard Grey, and then adding some extreme highlights of Carcharodon Grey. The bones and claws were glazed and then highlighted with Skeleton Legion, with Vampire Fang being used to add sharpness to the edges. For the leather straps, I began with an initial highlight of Ancient Forest, which was followed up with an extreme highlight of Wasteland Brown. The fur pelts were picked out with an initial highlight of Dust Bowl, before the more extreme edges were highlighted with Sandstorm. For the sword, I once again used Cold Corpse Blue and approached each flat facet or panel of the blade separately. I would apply the paint to a section and feather it out as I moved outwards. The opposite panel would remain dark, but the section below it was painted. This would result in an almost checkerboard-like pattern, where no colour would be positioned directly next to itself, helping to achieve that classic energy weapon effect. The trick here is to not use too much paint in your brush at one time. You're better off applying small amounts and leaving the paint to dry and adding more. Building up the layers incrementally will result in smoother results. To the centre of each block, a small band of Wolf Grey was steadily glazed on, creating a transition between the centre and outer edge of each block. In addition to this, the Wolf Grey was applied as an edge highlight along the edge of the blade and claws. The transitions and a few of the edges were then further lightened with some Gravestone Blue, before finishing off with some well-placed spots of White Star on the tips of the jagged edge. And with that, the painting was complete, which meant that I could give everything a varnish. I chose a matte varnish as it would not only protect the paintwork, but also remove some of the glossiness created by the washes. This was applied via my airbrush, but Rattlecan varnishes would work for this as well. With the model finished, work could begin on the base. To fall in line with the Spacewall theming, I opted for a frozen tundra effect. To build up the snow around the central rock, I used some of AK's snow. This is a texture paste, meaning it can be quite thickly in order to build up the appearance of piles of snow. After the snow paste had dried, I wanted to give the snow a more powdery look, as currently it looks more like pure white sand than snow. This was remedied by first applying a layer of AK snow sprinkles over the top, before sprinkling over some of AK's micro balloons whilst the previous layer was still wet, which allowed me to create a more realistic looking snow. This was done in small sections to prevent the gel from drying and repeated until the whole base and parts of the rock had been covered. To add the iconic blood associated with Khorne, I created a mixture of Tamiya Thinner, some X27 Clear Red, and X19 Smoke. This thin mixture was then lightly flaked onto the snow to create the appearance of splashes. Once dried, the splashes were quite intense, so I decided to give the appearance of having frozen over in the cold environment, and this was done by applying a thin layer of snow sprinkles over the top. And with that, I was left with this. And here we have the completed Leman Russ Daemon Primarch of Khorne, a recreation of the alternative timeline of the Dornian Heresy. With this conversion, I set out to create three things. The model needed to be something that was recognizable as a Daemon Primarch dedicated to Khorne. It needed to be different enough from the Angron base model, and it had to be recognisable as a Space Wolf, albeit a twisted, mutated version of one. And I think I've managed to achieve all three. Building entirely new miniatures like this can be tricky, as there isn't really anything you can use for inspiration, so you need to rely on your own imagination a little more. However, on the flip side, the lack of precedent for a Demon Russ meant that I had a lot more freedom with what the finished model could look like. Ultimately, it was a challenge, but a rewarding one. So if you have any other ideas for other Dornian or Robotian Heresy characters, or even just some what-if scenarios, then leave me your suggestions in the comments below. Alternatively, if you would like to see me expand this theme into a full army, I'd love to hear it. For those of you looking to recreate this miniature and colour scheme, I'll include all the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with a few affiliate links to where you can pick them up for yourself. But before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Big Tom, Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Brushlick Nim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Jonathan Sandsteed, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free and early access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.